Hello, and welcome to this lecture on the President's and public policy, on domestic policy and making. So let's see. We'll first go into the public policy cycle, and I have a whole bunch of stuff that I'm going to put up here as we go. There's a visual representation I'd like you to follow along if you would. So there's this nice clockwise representation that is also in your textbook of what the policy cycle is. So anybody here who has taken a intro class on, anybody who's taken an intro class on public policy or American government will already know this, but it's worth going through because it kind of sets the stage for these three very central cases about how presidents have interacted with making public policy and all kinds of other policy or policies within public policy, I should say. Policy. So I would say we should begin at the beginning, but the beginning is not really the beginning, as you'll see. So it's a good jumping on point. Agenda setting is what we usually think of as the beginning of the public policy cycle. But as you'll see, it's not really always beginning. Agenda setting is how people come up with ideas, and they put those ideas on the agenda. So what does it mean to be put on the agenda? Well, it's the thing that people are talking about. It's the words on everyone's lips. It's the issues that are hot that day. It's the overarching kind of theme to the conversations that happen around politics and elections even, and certainly the law-making agenda. So if you want to be strictly speaking about it, the agenda of the day, for example, in Congress is whatever the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader decides. They are the things that people will literally be debating on the House floor. But that's kind of different from the national agenda. It probably is connected or related. But in terms of the national agenda, making a certain law or talking about roads and bridges that day in Congress might not be the same conversation that people are having over their, coffee makers or water coolers at work in normal times. It's what they read in the paper every day, or they saw online, or what was on TV. But in terms of the agenda about what the people want and what the lawmakers want, often those things are very interrelated, if not totally reflective of each other. So agenda setting is who can get what and how we can get ideas that matter to us put on the public agenda. And there are several ways. Two ways I just described are going through lawmakers themselves, public officials. That's why protests exist. It's why advertising exists. But it's also why newspapers exist. And all those things are just media. So through the media, through various forms of media, we can get our message across and try to persuade people to care about the things that we care about. And so agenda setting is the most organized, I would say, regular iteration of agenda setting that has to be an electoral political campaign to gain office. And so once the agenda has been connected to what the people want and the campaigns have kind of incorporated that, what they've heard from people on the campaign trail into their message, and once that's been integrated into their policy platforms and they've won election, they're going to do everything they can to get all of those issues they've kind of gathered through this conversation with the voters onto the public agenda itself. So that's all agenda setting. It's all just sort of getting the ideas that matter to you onto the public docket, onto the House floor, the Senate floor, into the public conversation, and next is policy formulation. So now once we're talking about the same things, we're all having the same discussion. Then it's a matter of actually coming up with real ideas that address not only the issues and agendas, but also, the issue. So this is like deciding on what issues to talk about, and even at that stage, policy formulation is writing bills in Congress. It's writing bills in the legislature. It's drafting bills. It still can be part of this. Part of this can be taking things from the campaign and taking ideas from the official kind of policy papers that campaigns often put out. So, policy formulation is really broad and multifaceted. So it's not just Congress and it's not just the president, but when it is Congress and the president trying to get a law passed to address an issue, Congress has its own kind of policy operation, really a very vast policy operation. It's somewhat incoherent because there's the majority leader and the minority leader, and they all have their committees. All these people have staff and they have trusted allies. They have outside interest groups that help them with formulating public policy. And at the time By the time you get to putting those together, once you're putting them together, you're actively engaging in the next stage, which is decision making. Let's see, the next stage, which is decision making. You're attempting to get decision making, you're attempting to see how far you can push the negotiations between the ideals of what the various players in Congress want. As far as the president's concerned, the president is trying to do what he or she can to integrate the ideas from his campaign into congressional policy agenda at the same time, which is not easy. It's often a very delicate balance between trying to demonstrate that you are leading the public conversation in Congress while also not being overly, pushy, overly forceful with Congress because they will push right back. So showing leadership while also showing deference is very difficult, or at least it seems to be a very difficult dynamic that presidents often get wrong. But they, when they get it right, they can make, as they say, beautiful music together. So once they did engage in decision making, that's when they passed something. Okay, so through Congress and the president, they passed something, and the president has elected to sign whatever comes out of Congress, or decided to sign whatever comes out of Congress. That is a decision. That is, when the law is crafted and the law has been passed, a decision has been made. So everything within policy formation and decision making is kind of this dance between Congress and the president at the national level. Not only what to do about those issues, but then how to do them. Then we get into implementation and administration. Let's see. Pardon me. So then we get into implementation and administration, and that is where the president really comes in a much more prominent way. Even if the president wasn't so involved in the passing of a certain law, and the implementation of an administration of a law is by definition, by legal definition, by constitutional definition, what the president is supposed to do, or at least what his employees in the executive branch are supposed to do. So within that framework, there's a lot of leeway that presidents have. Sometimes they can, as you saw in another chapter, presidents can issue signing statements, and those signing statements can be very often be almost contradictory to what the law's passage said, and we're not going to get into that today. But when the president signs a bill, that is not the end of the story before the law can be implemented and the law can be enforced or carried out, or whatever verb you want to use, administered. The president has to, or traditionally will, write a signing statement, which means that this is what I understand by this law. And it frustrates lawmakers in Congress, because sometimes the president will all but veto a bill by writing a signing statement. And it's hard to do. I can't pull an example right now, but the signing statement that will say, we'll understand that just because there's been a law enacted, they will not interpret the law as something that the U.S. administration will have to immediately enforce, or this year even. So their lawyers kind of work on what a signing statement will need to be. So when it's finally administered, the president can designate it to an agency that's already been designated as that agency's responsibility within the legislation. But the president can, and the executive branch can, then take the law and work it into their existing budget and responsibilities and policy implementation calendar, if they don't have an issue with doing that, if they don't want to all but veto it by a signing statement. But these three things are always very linked. So as a law is implemented and administered, it begins to get feedback. That's what's called policy feedback. So it can be, let's see, when a law is implemented, guess who's evaluating it? Surprise, everyone. So not only is Congress evaluating how well you stuck to the letter of the law that they passed, but also the public is evaluating how well the president is doing in implementing this law. And that goes into agenda setting. It kind of goes into, okay, is the president doing a good enough job that now we can relax about this issue? And we don't need to pass another law related to it. Or, is it more a question of course we have to pass another law, but what direction are we going to go based on where we are with this policy implementation? So what do we mean by that? Well, let's talk about a couple of case studies that are in your book. Let's talk first about Social Security, credited largely to FDR and the New Deal. Under Social Security, there's a whole system that's being implemented whereby, you earn credits while you're working. While you're contributing to current retirees, you are also earning credit towards your own retirement. So, it's kind of brilliant because it creates its own constituency. It makes it so that you're quite literally invested in the Social Security fund in a collective way because you have built credits up and you don't want to ever see a change because it's helped determine your taxes and your wages up until now. So it's sort of like people would have to give you all of your back pay back, and that doesn't seem fiscally feasible. If you were at, if you were to zero out Social Security and all the people who pay taxes into it would sort of want their money back. And then so, right then it just kind of starts to unravel sources, begins to become untenable, which is fundamentally why Social Security is so structured the way that it is, and back to the time when it was first crafted during the New Deal. Well, something that's not in your book is that President Roosevelt had experienced, everyone had experienced something called the Bonus March after World War I and between then and World War II, kind of in the early days of the Great Depression. The Bonus March was simply the beginning of Great Depression veterans who had been promised or had seen their parents or grandparents receive bonuses or stipends or pension based on their service in the Civil War. And so it had been very much a part of American culture at the time that if you were credited for service in the U.S. military during a war, you were likely to receive, there was an expectation really, that you'd get some kind of lifelong bonus or pension that was related to that service. Because most of the Civil War generation had just about died out by this time, the World War I generation were the ones who were really experiencing the Great Depression. And so veterans often have also a lot of trauma, of course, after serving in war. This is true of every war. And so there's often a lot of need for psychological assistance. It's very often linked to, very unfortunately, substance abuse. So there's a lot of problems even today that we still struggle with veterans that are returning from service. But this time there was very little things that the federal government was doing to help with that. And veterans and everyone had no safety net. They had no social safety net to fall back on, no kind of bare minimum, living expenses to be able to rely on. And that is why there was a bonus march, I believe in the year 1929 or 30, and veterans had demanded they receive some kind of compensation because they were now out of work and were entitled to it because of their service in World War I. It had just been a delay. And they never received them. And Roosevelt did not want to create another cycle where veterans were privileged over other people. Because if you go back and read the history of this, the pensions that resulted from the Civil War was this kind of messy ongoing struggle to keep making new people eligible for pensions by recognizing their service in the Union, for the Union in the Civil War. As people got older, they loosened the requirements to such an extent that over 30% of the male population in northern states by 1900 were receiving pensions. And also widows were receiving those pensions as well. So a lot of women, they weren't counting those numbers the same way. But 30% of the households of seniors over 65 basically were receiving in the northern states those veterans' pensions. So it's just way over and above the number of people who actually served. So what Roosevelt wanted, he wanted this to be more universal. And he certainly thought, he thought it'd be more democratically feasible in the sense that, you wouldn't be creating a constituency, you'd be making everyone more or less invested and indebted to the political system. So that's what they did. They passed Social Security. It was originally called OAI, Old Age Insurance. It's now called today OASDI, Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance. And it's gone through a lot of different cycles. Social Security, when it was first created, and this is all the agenda setting that I talked about. The Great Depression had this terrible instance of workers being out of work and families going hungry. But older folks were not even in the structure that we know today. There was just not the kind of elderly care system that we even have now, and so which is not credited as being the best in the world or anything, but it was not even the structure we have now did that exist back then. And so policy formation was trying to decide, what can we make so that we can feed ourselves and clothe ourselves into old age. And the decision making was just what I've been talking about. And now the implementation, since 1935, it's gone through many different improvements. And I would have to say that also just there's a lot of constant evaluation about whether or not Social Security will go bankrupt. I do think bankrupt is a very misleading term. I have to say, because most of the fund is funded, it's really funded almost fully for the next 15 years or so. But it's even then, it's not as if they just run out of money like that. It's what happens is they have to make some adjustments. Congress has the full ability to make these adjustments. For example, right now, and the Congress has the full ability to make these adjustments. Like right now, I think the only adjustment that would have to be made is that the number is $137,000 a year. The first $137,000 a year that you make is taxed. But if you make over $250,000, there's like another 0.9% is taxed on top of that income. But I don't want to get into today how Social Security is funded, but just to say that payroll taxes and your employer pay into the fund is not only contributing to your credit, but is also funding current retirees and folks on disability insurance. So what they could do is simply index it for inflation. So the income, the kind of maximum income that is taxed under Social Security would go up every year. This goes up every year by a small cost of living adjustment, much like many other government programs like Social Security receive. But Congress can simply raise the cap to limit, what people can contribute. It actually functions as a regressive tax because the more you make over $137,000, the less of a percentage you pay in Social Security taxes. There have been 2 times in recent memory where presidents have tried to partially privatize Social Security by expanding individual retirement accounts. The first time was President Clinton, and he was kind of taken off the presidential agenda because of really a presidency-related personal scandal that kind of overtook his presidency in 1998, so he's no longer able to really guide any sort of major political conversations after that. They had basically decided to partially privatize Social Security through a deal with House Republicans and Senate Republicans. But they got caught up in an impeachment trial and a sex scandal, and his agenda just completely stalled. And then George W. Bush attempted it soon after his re-election in 2004, just 6 years later, but his presidency similarly stalled after his very unpopular handling of the Hurricane Katrina tragedy and the Iraq War. The next president did not centerpiece Social Security, but rather healthcare. This is President Obama. So healthcare was this very difficult thing to move because apparently even though President Obama had a pretty solid majority in the House, he also had 60 votes in the Senate. And from other lectures and discussions in this class, you know how difficult it is to pass anything in the Senate without a kind of filibuster-proof majority over 60. But they had one. And as I mentioned, President Obama really did kind of allow the Senate to he really did pander to some of the more marginal members of the Senate who were frankly more conservative or more moderate members of the House as well. And the Senate Democratic Caucus to get all 60 of those folks. But there's a lot of lessons learned from healthcare. They had the policy formulation again. The campaign was decision making, was one of those decisions. The president made what was the president made a decision that was, in a way, opposite to what President Clinton and Hillary Clinton had done while she was First Lady 20 years before this. He said, I'm going to do the opposite of them, of what they did, which is come up with a plan and then just give it to Congress and ask them to pass it. He said, I'm going to stay out of it, but I'm going to push it, and there's a couple of other lessons that we'll draw upon, but the implementation was really, I think, admittedly, you have to say, not good. The implementation was of the new healthcare law was that it took so long to pass. The rollout of it was myhealthcare.gov was the name of it. And the healthcare exchanges were not very good. The website crashed. I think the majority of states that were controlled by Republican governors and legislatures opted not to take the Obamacare subsidies to give underinsured people health insurance. So they made it very difficult for people to get on the federal exchanges. And then the agenda setting, the Republicans just kept hammering away during the Romney campaign in 2012 and the Trump campaign in 2016 that they wanted to repeal and replace Obamacare, really before it had been fully implemented. And they were finally able to, with a Republican majority in the Trump administration, actually do it. They were actually able to repeal the individual mandate that people had to buy health insurance. But that doesn't mean they were able to replace it with any coherent new system. They actually left in place a large portion of what was passed, and that is banning banning the practice by health insurance companies of refusing to cover people for pre-existing conditions, and by health insurance providers, and by allowing people who are up to age 26 to remain on their parents' health care. Those are the kind of three legs of the triangle: was the mandate, the subsidies, and allowing them to be on their parents' health insurance up to age 26. So both of those things were passed and they were retained, and just the repeal of the individual mandate, some of the subsidies were repealed. So healthcare continues to be on the agenda because of the very fragmented nature of the implementation of the Obamacare policy. I think it's fair to say that it's been a direct consequence of the growing popularity of that program. So Social Security and healthcare, two ideas of policy, the policy process and agenda setting, all the way back to policy feedback. As you can see, it's kind of a continuous process, and this is just a framework for viewing it all. We can talk more about it. Thanks for watching.